Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Charles Leclerc responds to a disastrous crash in the first free practice session today here in Montreal to derail what was already a chaotic weekend for Ferrari, and now it has arguably got even worse. It's not been a good track for them over the last few years. Leclerc has made his life even worse today as a result. Fred Vasseur comes out to defend his own position at Ferrari, but some believe this is the beginning of the end of his tenure in the team, and we know what Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari think about that in general. The key winners of the day though look like Mercedes. Their upgrades seem to have worked a treat so far. Where do McLaren sit? What does the long run data say? That's the big topic of today's discussion. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into today. Just got back from the track itself and it was honestly a great experience. This circuit is gorgeous. Like honestly, the energy, the nature, like the rowing lake that they've got thing going on, the lake in the middle. Honestly, a brilliant experience, so definitely recommend the Grand Prix so far if you guys haven't been to this particular one, and, well, it should probably only get better throughout the weekends. Let's talk about what happened on track today, though, because, of course, you know, being at the track, you can't see everything that's happening all of the time, but I was doing my best to keep up with it as it was happening. We have some upgrades. McLaren, they brought a couple of changes. In the first free practice session, there were plenty of Flovis on those two McLaren cars working on a few ideas. Now, there was some discussion as to whether these are necessarily going to be permanent changes or not, whether they are just testing things. The reality is McLaren is still going to win the Constructors regardless, but Max is well positioned to potentially threaten. Mercedes have a couple of changes too, nothing to the Ferrari, but a few performance upgrades here and there throughout the grid. But I think especially Mercedes, they brought a couple of parts. It seems to be working reasonably well early on. The car seems quite stable. It is a couple of conditions that should favour them. It is worthy of note though, before I forget, today was relatively cool, and the second free practice session where Russell was very strong, as we'll get into, was later in the day, actually far later in the day than the race will be on Sunday. That means cooler temperatures today than Sunday. That means maybe a harder time for Mercedes when it comes to the actual race, but time will tell. Qualifying, as we know this year, is particularly important, as is keeping your job. And Christian Horner says he's not going anywhere from Red Bull Racing, but Fred Vasseur might be. And the reason why I've got this highlighted is because I just went to search it to see if this was actually a real quote. And as far as I can tell, this is a real quote. Fred Vasseur was very, and I would say even surprisingly aggressive with his kind of pushback on these rumours around his job security. We talked about it yesterday. We talked about it this morning. Responses from Leclerc, from Hamilton, and what is going on at the Scuderia right now. And the general theory is that the team is losing faith and trust that Fred Vasseur is the right man for the job. Now, the drivers certainly do not agree with that assessment, but it does feel like the top brass at Ferrari are flexing their muscles to some degree. Now, whether Vasseur goes immediately, you know, I doubt it. But his contract does expire at the end of the year, and will it get renewed? That's the big question. So Vasseur was pretty attacking about the media, really, and the comments that were being made in the Italian press. We must ask ourselves the right questions if Ferrari hasn't won for years. We've changed the team principle, the drivers, we've changed everything except one thing, which can kind of only imply the management or the culture or the structure or the relationship between the sports car team and the racing team, or exactly what Fred Vasseur's getting at is a little unclear. But what is clear is that this is quite the thing to say, and people have definitely read into it in certain ways. Vasseur was also critical of the media as well, of course, not just his own team, but clearly it seems like he's making something of a statement. I don't understand the target. Perhaps it's to, trash talk the team. Perhaps it's the only way for them to exist. This is probably more the reason, but it is really hurting the team. And look, it is fair enough. Ferrari have bigger fish to fry. They have other things that they probably should be focusing on, more so than dealing with all of this media criticism. But frankly, this is the merry-go-round. It is what it is. Vasseur says that he's very calm. I am not the issue. I'm experienced enough and old enough to make my decisions. And when I joined Ferrari, I knew perfectly well that I would be in this situation. And that is life. So Vasseur, it seems, gets it. What happens next is a big question. Vasseur says that, it's too much, the rumours from the Italian media. They've, got their man, I suppose, but it's not helping really anyone in this scenario. But I thought this tweet was maybe the most compelling. So Giuliano De Chessa, we know is very well connected at Ferrari, said the following: Vasseur has decided for the clash, so effectively to fight fire with fire. My feeling is that we should not expect any immediate intervention from the Ferrari top brass. The 3-year contract, though, expires at the end of the year. I listened to him carefully, and from the way he spoke today, I had the personal feeling that he will not remain. So, take that as you will. It's only an opinion, it's only a perspective, but for those that know the situation quite intimately and are hearing what Fred Vasseur is saying publicly, there is a feeling here from De Keyser that he doesn't think that contract is getting extended. He thinks that Vasseur is going to go at the end of the season. That would be a really big move. I personally think that it would be, even if it's not a mistake, it's indicative of a wider problem with Ferrari, which is which is preventing them from winning right now. And maybe they're forgetting what they really should be doing. So that's the Vasseur situation. Plenty else to talk about. Max was also asked about what if he gets a penalty, another 1 penalty point that would effectively cause him to get a race ban, as we well know. Max was asked about this and says, look, in general, missing a race is not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Going to spend more time with my, newborn, right? Although some would say, look, I paid money to go watch this guy race. You better be there. But, it is what it is. Max is pretty chill about it. I don't think he's going to get a race ban, but you can't rule it out as it stands. But let's get into qualifying, because there's plenty of drama on track today. The session had barely started, and Colapinto was round at turn 2, and then he did it again later in the session. I will say, on the Colapinto piece, obviously a tricky day for him again today. Certainly from a confidence building perspective, it will be a bit of a challenge. And Gasly did another pretty stellar job today. I think it's so impressive what Gasly is currently doing at Alpine. There's a couple of ways to read it. Either Doohan and Colapinto are just not very good, and Gasly is, pretty mediocre to good and is doing an excellent job. Maybe the car just suits Gasly's style really well. That's maybe also possible. And I think we know what Colapinto is capable of. When he stepped into the Williams last year, and in the first few Grand Prix, he was within pretty much a tenth of Albon. That was really impressive. But after that, it kind of fell away a little bit. And this year, of course, has been a struggle. But also, he stepped into a car a few races into a season, which is always a massive challenge at the best of times. So, I think it's deserving to give a little bit of time. But I do think that the takeaway for me today is that, Gasly and Alpine are working really well as a partnership right now. And that should be commended, I would say, more so than criticising some of the others that have recently struggled there. But this was the big talking point outside of the Vasseur drama. Charles Leclerc in the war. Now, as the session got underway, there was a couple of times in the 116s, Max then was bringing it down to a 114 or so, then Charles Leclerc put in the fastest lap time, something like a 113.4. It was looking pretty good. Ferrari and Leclerc were looking reasonably good at the start of the session. Leclerc was obviously feeling pretty confident on this C6 compound, which is not a good tyre. And I wonder if Aston Martin will try their trick again as they did in Imola, where they're running the medium tyre, the C5 in qualifying. That could very much so be a viable strategy, to be honest, again this weekend. But where it affected Aston Martin in Imola was that they then had no good tyres for the race. So this is almost why the teams all qualify on the C6, not necessarily because it's the better tyre, but because they need the mediums, right? And, that is a problem. So some teams might still give it a go tomorrow with the C5 compound, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do, but the C6 will still be the primarily used tyre because they simply need to save the good race tyres rather than qualify as best as they can. That's the argument anyway, but, around certain circuits, that argument's maybe somewhat different, and who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But Leclerc was going well, and then he ends up in the wall. And this was a really difficult one. Here he is with his helmet kind of half off. His car's getting rigged up in the background, of course. Everyone's going to get to see the floor of that thing. We also got to see the walk. We had, crash from Checo Perez in the rain a little while ago here as well. And, he was criticised for it, for sure. And I think Leclerc deserves plenty of criticism for this one today. Lance Stroll crashed later in the day as well, sure. And was he clowned for it? Yeah, he was clowned for it. And Charles Leclerc, this was a very important, critical, influential crash at the end of the day. He crashes it, then he gets to go on the scooter, right, to take him back. So, quite the trick that Charles Leclerc had to do here after this moment. But understandably, people are criticising him heavily for this, and I think that it is deserving. Now, look, does it change my opinion that Charles Leclerc is a World Championship caliber winning driver? No, I think that he is. But, there are probably, I would say still, too many moments like this per season for people to have the utmost faith in Leclerc to execute, if he did have the car. Like, if the car was there this year, and moments like this were still happening, that's when, there would be serious criticism. And still, I think it is deserving in this case. Yeah, there's never a good time to crash. But at the start of FP1, when you've got another free practice session later in the day, look, at the end of the day, if you're pushing super hard at the end of FP2, yeah, maybe the guys can fix the car overnight. It's not ideal. But in this particular moment, it was certainly suboptimal and broke the car for the rest of the day, ruining valuable practice time. Look, if Ferrari had brought upgrades, it could have been even worse, right? This is actually one of the reasons maybe why they didn't bring upgrades this weekend, is just in case something like this happened. Leclerc says, I'm in the wall, my bad, should have gone straight. I thought I'll make it, but I just clipped the wall. And if you look at the onboard here of actually what happens, so Leclerc locks up the front right tyre. We've seen this before, right? I mean, famously, Vettel and Hamilton, when they had the incident when Vettel got the 5-second penalty all those years ago. A very similar thing occurred, but on that occasion, he was able to keep it on the track. So Leclerc had, he didn't have much time, but he had probably half a second, which is not much time. But he had to make a decision. Am I going to go straight off into the runoff area, or am I going to keep the car alive? Now, I think in hindsight, it's very obvious that you just have to go to the runoff area here, because there's nothing to gain by, Leclerc at this point knows he's in too deep, he's locked up, he's not making the corner. So if you're not making the corner, then what's the point? You're not completing the lap anyway, so it just doesn't really matter. And also you're going to go on the grass and pick up grass on the tyres, so that's not ideal. So really in this moment, Leclerc has to just commit to the escape road, as we've seen in the past. But he doesn't. He sends it in. At this point, it's too late. He thinks he can maybe still make it. He kind of releases some of the steering angle here, but then he has a snap of oversteer. That puts him onto the grass, and at this point, he's nothing but a passenger as he smashes into the wall on the left-hand side, destroys both of his front and rear suspensions, and then he's in the wall. So, there was a decision that could have been made round about here. Leclerc didn't make it, and that, of course, ended in disaster. And as a result, he's not going to be there. And he wasn't there in FP2, as we know. Vasseur has gone and left the garage. We think that we damaged the chassis, won't be able to do the FP2 by the regulations. So even though they can fix the front and the rear suspensions in time, the crash was relatively significant enough that the survival cell needed to be replaced. That means checks. That means testing by the regulations. That means he couldn't do FP2. So bit of a disaster. There is some positives maybe to take away. Leclerc crashed at Baku 2024 and he took pole. So, if that's anything to go by, take it as you will. But on a weekend where Ferrari have had massive challenges on and off the track, and historically has been a very tricky weekend here for Leclerc and for Ferrari in general, not what he would have wanted to see today, and not what Ferrari, the Scuderia, Fred Vasseur would have wanted to see today either. And it's not like Lewis Hamilton. He was okay today, Hamilton. He wasn't massively dissatisfied, but it wasn't exactly rapid, and we'll see the numbers on that in a second. Now, interestingly enough, at the start of the day, I was kind of looking at the scoreboard at the track thinking, okay, where are McLaren going to be? And when are they going to decide to turn up and really turn in some good performances? That didn't really happen today until the end of FP2. It was actually the Williams. They were the impressive team out there. And Max was very, very close to being dethroned by one of the Williams boys during this session. Max is pretty fast, and I think that Red Bull will be pretty happy about today as well. I definitely think we do have a race on our hands this weekend. Ferrari may not be in the mix. Leclerc hasn't helped matters on his side of the garage. Williams, let's be realistic here, probably, when push comes to shove, are not going to be in the mix. But Max on these softest compounds seems like he's going to be able to be there. Even the Aston Martin wasn't slow today, but the McLarens are going to be quick. And both of the Mercedes, they were really mighty fast today in many respects. Max tops the leaderboard at 1:13.9. Albon and Sainz were right behind him. Then we had Russell, then Hamilton, and then it was pretty mixed up and all over the place after that. But it's not like it was a good session for either of the two McLarens in the morning. And then, well, it actually was the afternoon, but the same kind of thing anyway. And then when the evening session began for FP2, then there was more drama. Leclerc hits the wall coming out of turn 7. And then his front left suspension just snaps in half, right? And he gets it back in the ends, but wasn't great for Stroll to hit the wall in this way. I wonder, if it did anything to his wrists here. Obviously, we know that he's had the injury, right, coming into this weekend, so that's been a key talking point, and whether that's going to affect him, right? Of course, missed the rest of the free practice session, but like, he's in front of the home crowd. They've renamed the grandstand as well by the hairpin, the Lance Stroll grandstand now. So, plenty of Lance Stroll fans here at the track, of course. But Max was not very happy about his car as well. He did get better in the end of the session. The FP1 session was probably slightly better for the Red Bull, and Max says the tyre's broken. It's getting worse and worse. Like, what are you playing at, guys? Max was basically told, look, just get on with it. We're trying to learn what we can. So it wasn't ideal. Hamilton went out there on the soft tyre. He was struggling to get a really good run in, found that the brakes were pulling slightly to the left. So, more things were going bad to worse for Ferrari. But the big winners really were Mercedes. They brought the upgrade. Russell put in a 112.1 on the medium though. So critical to note this, that the medium tyre, the C5, does seem to be, maybe even still on this track, the preferred compound. Certainly there isn't much performance delta between them. Maybe the medium is faster, maybe it's not. But, for the McLarens, they'll be confident they can keep their tyres alive. But even the McLarens, Norris did a good few laps where his first sector was, purple, second sector purple, third sector gets to the hairpin, loses the rear, literally can't get any grip going out of the corner, right? So, the guys were struggling with that heavily today. Whereas the C5, the medium this weekend, is certainly not giving up on the drivers as the soft does. But at the end of the session, Lando and McLaren did find a way to recover a little bit. It wasn't great for them today. It wasn't clean at all, but they did find a way to get to second in the end. George was first, Antonelli was third, and this was the overall ranking. So Charles Leclerc didn't get a lap in, neither really, well, did Lance Stroll, of course he did too, but nothing particularly timed. But Norris was within 300. But that was set later in the session, right? So there was a feeling that the track conditions were ramping up, and Piastri was still about 4/10 off. I think tomorrow morning, it actually is still the afternoon. I think it's 12:30 the time tomorrow. Local time for the third free practice session and the final one. That's usually where McLaren start to push much harder. We'll see if that comes true tomorrow as well. But even then, the Williams was still kind of there. I know that you can say that it wasn't that representative. Max was down here in P9, and, some teams put their laps in at different times, shall we say. Gasly again was P12. Colapinto had a very difficult session again. But, Hamilton was not having a torrid time, but it just wasn't very quick. And both of the Mercedes were looking relatively strong. And then, of course, Lando turned up at the end of the session. His long-run data is compelling, but I will say it's not dominant, right? It doesn't appear, anyway, so far, that McLaren have a machine which is going to just run away with it at the front, which makes it clear to me that qualifying tomorrow is going to be critical for what's going to happen in the Sunday race. This was the medium run that Lando did, 116s mid to lows, and then, a bit of degradation at the end of the stint, went to a 117 flat on a couple of occasions. This was George's long run on the C5. And, we see some pretty straightforward degradation. 116, starting, let's say, with a 4, 1, 3, 0, 1, 3, 5, 3, 6. Then a bit of deg, 16, 7, 16, 8, 17, 1. So, okay, over that run, it's, we don't know fuel loads. We don't know engine modes. The normal caveats apply. But still, respectable lap times, and something that, was a little bit of degradation, right? There's clearly a bit of deg at the end of the stint, but no more than the McLarens had. That's the key takeaway, I think, for the Mercedes today. This was some of the long-run data on the medium tyre for the other contenders. This was Verstappen. His laps were a little bit all over the place, but when he was on a decent stint, 116.6, 3, 1, 3, 0, 2, 2, that type of stuff. Hamilton, again, a bit all over the place. His lap time seemed, again, a bit more inconsistent, a bit slower. I think that's kind of indicative of where that Ferrari is right now, to be honest. And, these are some other contenders, right? Piastri's lap times, again, were kind of mid-116s. If we look at it from top to bottom, it looks something like this. So Russell's lap times looked like the most compelling. 116.5. Norris, 116.5. Piastri, 116.6. Max, 116.7-ish. Antonelli, 116.7. Then the two Williams, then Hadjar, then Gasly, then Colapinto, then Hamilton. So, things not looking great for Ferrari at all. And I'm not sure that should be a massive surprise around this circuit based on what we have seen her over the last couple of years. But, yes, I'm sure that these top front runners here had different levels of fuel and the other factors as we know. But still, the fact that we have all these drivers within a couple of tenths on race pace, that is a very compelling thing for the rest of the weekends. And it is just quickly worthy to note that if you look at the top, 7 drivers here, all of them Mercedes powered. So yeah, Mercedes engines have been coming under some criticism with the Antonelli and the Alonso failures over the last couple of weekends, but still a good day out for high performance powertrains. Max says the day was all right. FP1 was pretty happy with the car. FP2 is a bit more of a challenge, but maybe for qualifying it's going to get a little bit better. And that's pretty much where we are going to leave it for today. So tomorrow's qualifying will be at the track to see how everything transpires, and hopefully it's as kind of entertaining as and enthralling as today was, because I think today set up really nicely for what's going to be a fascinating weekend here. And it's not clear-cut at all right now what's going to happen tomorrow and, of course, on Sunday. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.